Peace education in the military may seem surprising, but one of our next presenters made that his career. Before retiring, Major Philip Shelton served 25 years in the U.S. Air Force and Illinois Air National Guard. He supervised the Guard's Human Resource Office and was a master facilitator for diversity, equity, and inclusion. He is now Director of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity for the Indianapolis branch of Housing and Urban Development. He speaks here with two peace activists. Rita Rubin Long is a lifelong public school teacher from Providence, Rhode Island, a volunteer peace educator, and survivor of the National Guard shooting at Kent State 52 years ago. David Weinberg from Guilford, Connecticut, is a lawyer, community television advocate, and executive director of the Global Peace Education Network. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you, Michael, for your introduction. It's my privilege to moderate this important conversation on peace, social justice, and cultural competence, as it is one of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. With us, we have Ms. Rita Rubin Long. She's a teacher who is a survivor of the Kent State University event in the May 4th of 1970. She is a member of the Women in Harmony Chorus, a chorus of women's voices who sing for social justice and the joy of making music together. We also have David Weinberg, a peace activist, a lawyer, and a producer. In fact, he's helping produce this conference. So let's begin with our questions, and we're going to start off with, how did you all get involved with social justice, and what keeps you committed to it?
I think I got started a long time ago when I lived in New York, and I loved that the UN was there, but I was a little child, and I was with lots of different people from all over the world. And then I moved up to a smaller place, Rockland County, and eventually switched to go to school at Kent. But when I was a young girl, I would go to all the rock and roll shows. I went to Woodstock, and I just had this vision of, I don't know, a world at peace, a world that cooperated with each other. And I think that's what got me started.
Philip, there's a lot of factors. You know, my grandparents on both sides were refugees and immigrants, and my maternal grandfather came because he was an activist in Ukraine, in the Russian Empire, and my great uncle actually, his father wanted to get him out of the country because he was afraid he would end up in Siberia or worse. So I had that kind of activist background in my family. At the same time, nobody is more patriotic than a refugee because they see the contrast. And when I was a kid, I grew up in a changing neighborhood, in a demographically changing and racially changing neighborhood. So I got to see some inequity firsthand, but at the time also on television, there was a lot of, it was the time of the Freedom Riders and different civil rights marches. And it was clear to me that people were suffering the same kind of injustice and inequity here in this country, which I was told wasn't supposed to happen. That was what my parents told me, that's what the school told me, and yet I could see from my own eyes that that wasn't true. And so it was at that time that I started juggling these concerns. And I would say, you know, key element was when Dr. King was killed, because we had National Guard troops stationed in our school, which was kind of shocking. And I could look down Madison Street in Chicago on the west side, which is where I grew up, and the street was actually on fire. So those events had an enormous impact and really kind of solidified my commitment to want to do something about peace and social justice.
All right. With those historically significant events that you have both marked, what since then keeps you passionately committed to this cause?
Well, I've worked with young children for a very long time. And I think my own love of nature and exploration and discovery, and watching how children just want to enjoy their life, get to know each other, learn as best as they can, that has really helped me, like in a passion for peace and for learning. And now I teach at a senior college with people that are 55 and over, and even though they've had so many experiences, everyone seems to want to feel good in some way. And although there's a lot of factors that are challenging, I think that's part of my passion for this whole.
That's a really deep question, and it's difficult to answer in a soundbite. One thing, sort of going back to my past, the other thing that happened, I'm going to refer back a little bit, because the other thing that was happening when I was in college was the war in Vietnam was happening. And I was affected by the injustice of that, but it also affected me personally, because there was at least a chance that I might have to serve. And I thought that war was completely wrong. I didn't understand the justification. I didn't understand why many of my friends were actually being drafted and forced to fight. They were like, okay, I'm an American, I'll go over there, that's what I have to do, but they weren't sure why either. So, I had a personal stake in it. It wasn't entirely altruistic or unselfish. And I started getting interested in peace. And at the same time, I started to recognize that I had to be at peace myself if I was going to bring, and I wasn't. I definitely wasn't. So if I was going to talk to other people about peace, I needed to be at peace myself.
Listening to people that were just sort of movement speakers, I could feel that there wasn't my own personal feeling of being comfortable with it. So I had to find my own way as well to get comfortable and to work for things that I believe.
Philip, you have a lot of experience in these areas, and I'd really like to hear some of your experience.
My take on that is because within the military, I was serving in the capacity of equal opportunity, diversity, equity, inclusion for the very same cause that has joined us together. The interesting part about it, and David, you suggested that in one of your original comments, is that a refugee or an immigrant is one of the most loyal of patriots. Because there's a difference between a patriot who will challenge what is wrong with America and a nationalist who doesn't want anything to change. So with that, I was, of course, very well versed, especially in the National Guard, because the unfortunate thing is you're seeing with the January 6th insurrection, many members of the military are starting to show up with their nationalist perspectives that are impediments to social justice.
In the military, they don't once you're in, they don't just put you in the field and say, fight a war. There's a lot of training and preparation. You were just talking about discipline that takes place. And that's how we approach most things in life. There's learning, there's practical experience, there's discipline, there's training. But then when it comes to peace, we go, we'll just stumble around. It'll happen, or we pray for it, or we give out a greeting card in the winter, peace on earth, goodwill to men. But we don't take it seriously. It's perhaps the most important thing in our lives, but we treat it as though it's the least.
What I think we're going to get to here in a few minutes is what are the what are the things that we want to impart to people? What do we want to hold in their accountability that gives them the tools to implement change? Because I'm of the mentality of peace isn't everybody just holding hands for a few minutes and singing Kumbaya. It is a charge that each individual makes for there to be social change. And that is going to require a level of working through the cognitive dissonance that's necessary to challenge your own identity. And it has to be done individually, because it's too easy to hide in a group that mask it or recycles the certain things that actually don't implement change. What are you all's position on that?
The words that I was thinking of as you were talking were really understanding similarities and differences, and somehow holding in the middle, being a human being, and being able to make connections that kind of spoke out. If you're thinking of the wheel of a bicycle, that kind of put things together, and being conscious about that as you do what you do. Like in my chorus, we sing a lot of different kinds of songs, and we have these festivals with women from all over the United States. And some of the songs that we sing are kind of challenging, but our theme for January is going to be Lead with Love. And so somehow to get to, like, we're all alive, we're all here, how can we live well together? It's not like a kumbaya thing, but it takes a lot of work. But being conscious about it, I think it's very helpful.
For me, it starts with self-awareness. It starts with being able to listen to myself and really hear what's authentic. And that's a lot more challenging. It's easy to say, it's challenging to do. What's really my voice? What is it that I've been taught to think? What is it that society wants me to think, and what is actually real? So that takes a lot. You're talking about, connection, listening, intersection. That's really important. But even that involves my self-awareness. I can't listen to you if I'm just thinking. If I'm just listening to me, I can't listen to you. So I have to have enough awareness to shut up and listen. And there's more than an element in everything we're talking about. And I know I've heard Rita talk about Kent State, and I'm eager to hear a little bit more about that. But, you joined the service, and then you stood up and took a leadership role. I made a decision at least to go out into the streets first at the Chicago Convention in 1968. I didn't know quite what I was doing, but I wanted to put myself out there. And that takes a certain amount of courage. You were at Kent State in front of the National Guard that Philip was talking about earlier, armed to the teeth. That takes some courage. So I think there's an element of courage, and there's a quieter courage. You alluded to this, Philip, where you're in a group, and it's like jokes, right? People tell racial jokes, people tell jokes about women, misogynistic jokes, people tell all kinds of offensive jokes. And you always have a choice. Are you going to just kind of laugh and go along with it? Or are you going to challenge it? Or what are you going to do? And that's a challenge that never stops. But it takes a certain amount of courage to intervene or to do something. And that's a daily thing.
There seems to be this epidemic of fear, especially with regard to the shifting demographics that are taking place, that are exposing the social construct of race for being the fallacy that it has always been. And it's in that epidemic of fear, it's directly in contrast to the courage that's going to be necessary for those people who have historically been most resistant to change, most resistant to diversity. And to Rita's point, what I appreciate is music has always been a way to join people together. I would challenge anybody to listen to Stevie Wonder, for instance, and what he represents in just his lyrics. And I don't care what culture you come from. There's a certain element and a certain facet of music that supersedes all of our human existence and hits directly to the human spirit, that absolutely has no genetic representation. And I do know, and I don't want my context of singing Kumbaya to be dismissive of music, because I know that it has a remarkable healing effect. But I also know that those who are most challenged in their fear are going to be the most resistant to the change that we're trying to minister to society. So when you all have conversational confrontations with that, how would you go about trying to address it?
Well, one thing I've been thinking about lately is I read this article that this woman is putting in her book, and it's about listening as if your life depends on it. Mm-hmm. And this is about a detective who talked somebody down, who was, about to kill himself and had a SWAT team behind him. And that person started asking some questions and reflecting back and listening to somebody who was very, very, very upset, and found these little threads where that person could start to understand their own self a little bit, enough to say they could name what was happening to them. They were fed up. Mm-hmm. And it allowed this person to get off of that place they were, that precipice, to come down and not do the things that person wanted to do. So I think there's something about how David was talking about listening, how you just have the self-awareness to have your radar on, and the skills to be able to, do it with children, as a teacher. Somebody's totally frustrated. How do you get them to be willing to learn again? So I have this deep listening idea as something that's very important. I don't know if that answers your question, Philip.
I think it directly does, because those people who have pressed through the courage that David spoke of, where they're listening to understand rather than to refute, and try to maintain themselves, they're actually doing themselves a disservice and not embracing a growth opportunity. Because if just say the same way this conversation has taken on a synergy all of its own, and we can actually be energized, and there's a synthesis to it, is the example of the exchanges we want for people. But I can also say that it's easy here because everybody present has worked through the courage to have the conversation. So I do appreciate that, and I do know that it still resides in courage. But David, I also want to know either past or present and future experiences. How do you go about constructively conversing with people who are resistant to this change?
Well, I do, there's two elements. The first one we've all been talking about, and that is you really have to listen, and listen with intent, and in a way, listen to your heart.
It makes me think about a caring relationship, really. From what you're talking about, there's an element of your care for whoever you encounter and whatever kind of conversation you have, that you're trying, it seems like you're trying to have some kind of relationship, you know, make the choices, but not doing it out of anger, you know, or you're doing it more out of kindness.
And I think the authenticity of our expression is essential in actually affecting the change. It's like, as a person of color, there is a social axe that I have to grind. Hear me well. But what I'm going to do is I'm not going to use that axe in this conversation, because there's more of a growth opportunity for both of us, whomever that individual may be. It can be individuals of the same race or the same racial classification, because what the construct of race has done, being deeply rooted in social Darwinism, it's maintained that there always has to be a superior and an inferior, right? Even within race, there's colorism of all the things, you know, the trope of the house Negro versus the field Negro, and it being, you know, the variance by complexion within race is conceptually and in principle the exact same conversation. It's the exact same conversation that has to take place. Is I'm not coming from a position of superiority. I'm superior to no one, but I also know that I'm not inferior to anyone. And when you are communicating from that place, you're in a better, I think, position to edify the individual once they truly are able to sense that you're genuine and sincere with it. But until then, they're going to come at you with, you know, full guns blazing, and you have to know how to deflect and defend yourself, because what we're not required to do is to catch ourselves on fire to keep people warm. You know, that's not a part of this. But I can say that the social tropes that expect you to do so from a person coming from a position of privilege, they will often be the most resistant, because that sense of entitlement is their biggest impediment to better understanding.
I was reading about the Freedom Riders, and there was also a group, you may or may not be familiar with it. It was called Deacons for Defense. And so these Freedom Riders, they were trained in this Gandhian nonviolence. And they had made their mind up, and they had made a commitment that they were not going to retaliate even when they were faced with physical violence. And they lived up to it for the most part. And, you know, but what happened was, in parts of the South, that there were a lot of African American men who had been in the service, and they weren't going to go out and be part of social protest or anything like that, like a lot of men of all backgrounds from the service, like my father. After what they had seen, they were just interested in leading their lives as best they could and taking care of their families as best they could. But the moral courage of the original demonstrators summoned those men who might otherwise have stayed on the sidelines. It affects me every time I think about it. This is sort of this humanity that gets awakened. And we talk about social justice, And I think this is why it's important to put ourselves on the line. So here were these freedom riders, and they were being beaten in the streets. And then finally, these men showed up in their cars, and they were carrying weapons, and they said, "We're taking these people home. Enough's enough. You're not going to persecute them anymore, like you were just saying. You know, you're not going to set them on fire so you can stay warm." And to me, I found that a very moving story, because it's sort of the humanity of those people who had committed their lives and their bodies to social change summoned more people, and ultimately summoned people of all backgrounds from all over the country to support that cause. And that's how it grew over and over again. They very consciously said there'll be, for everybody who's beaten, 10 more people will come to our cause. So I don't exactly know the lesson of that, but there's a humanity, there is a sort of force, a moral force that I'm very moved by. I'm very touched by that. By somehow, by putting ourselves on the line day by day, we're calling forth, and that's each of us, we're calling forth the best of humanity by acting, listening to that moral compass in ourselves. It affects more than ourselves. It affects the world around us. And I think that's how this change has to happen. It's like one person at a time. I change, and then maybe one or two people around me may change, but that's how humanity changes, because it's all human beings. It's not societies. It's not tribes. It's not groups, nations, whatever. It's just each of us. Each of us is a human being. And the more authentically we pursue this humanity within ourselves, we're unconsciously, I think, maybe consciously, pulling other people with us. And that's how this change occurs.
David, you made me think about the women's movement and the right for women to vote. And our chorus did a whole concert about this with historical film perspective, and, you know, just seeing the courage of people a long time ago who wanted to make a change, and then the people who came along to either help them or not help them. But it was each individual person trying to make things better that has an effect. At least it had an effect on me, that the rights of women, men, human beings in this world, it's such a complicated world because of how things have been gone through history, how certain people make decisions. But then along with that is the idea that, that each of us is human and can try to make the world a little bit of a better place. And we're standing on the shoulders of some of the people that went before us. And I think there's a lot of women, my grandmother included, she was an immigrant. And when people were doing things in Brooklyn that she didn't like, she would get up on a soapbox and talk about it. And then they'd be looking for her. The police would look for her, and she'd knit herself another color hat. And then she'd go on. But I think this idea of how we unify and join together through our individual stories and our commitment to this is kind of a beautiful thing in a hard way. But I also remember when I was going to student teach, after I was in the whole protest at Kent State, and then I had to go to the dean's office because they weren't sure I was moral enough to be a teacher, and that I met the moral standards to be a teacher. And I had to kind of convince them, that I wanted to teach and to let me try it. And because I looked differently and did different things and was not a person from Ohio, I was, being from New York and having different values became pretty hard, but I got through it. I went and I did it, and I worked with the students, and then they were like, "Oh wow, she did a great job." And I just had to have a commitment to go on and do what I wanted to do.
In closing, I would like for all of us, I'll go last for this, but what I'd like to do is, we live in this generation of everything is like a hashtag and a trend or something like that. So what would be your individual catchphrase that encompasses all of what we've been discussing here? Rita, I'll start with you.
It's good to listen to each other and to try to hear each other, and to not just try to hear yourself as you're listening and trying to learn from each other.
I guess the phrase that I just made up is courage inside out.
I think mine would be social change is inevitable. Individual growth is optional.
I just heard the related statement for the first time a few weeks ago that conflict is inevitable and combat is optional.
So is there anything else, like in closing, that you want to share that I think just sort of wraps everything up? Because I think we've covered, I'm not going to say the gamut, because there's always going to be more, but I think we've done a remarkable job in representing the principles that's necessary for us to continue doing what we're committed to doing.
I just would like to say, Philip, that how much I've enjoyed getting to know you through this process. And although I already have, volunteered with David and know him for a long time, but just feeling your sense of commitment and humanity and my ability to learn with you and have fun at the same time, I would just like to thank you for that.
I appreciate that, Rita. It has indeed been a blast. I'm enjoying getting to know you as well.
Yeah, I'm kind of awestruck at what you do and what you've done in both the courage and the insight and the understanding it takes to reach out to people who have opinions that are just opposed to the way you look at the world, and you're still able to reach out to them and converse with them. And I'm certain that you've affected far more people than you even realize. So my hat's off and my heart's out to you.
Like, we have known each other for quite a few years, but it's like I've known you as, as a married into the family, but I can, now appreciate you for the man that you are. And I appreciate that. So I think that closes us out. It has been an absolute pleasure. Unless there's anything else from anybody, I think we're done.